The first time he saw her, she was sitting in the sunlight like a broken angel no one knew how to fix. Her wheelchair tilted slightly toward the sky, as if she were silently asking a question no one on earth could answer. And in that single, fleeting moment, Arif Qureshi, single father, construction worker, a man who had already lost too much, felt something shift inside his chest that he couldn't explain, as though fate itself had just placed a fragile miracle in his path and dared him to believe again. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of one small act to change a life, take a moment right now to like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel Heartfelt Stories. Stories like this remind us that even in the darkest corners, light can still find a way. Arif's mornings always began before the sun had fully risen, when the city was still quiet and the weight of responsibility felt heavier in the silence. He would wake up in his modest one-room apartment, careful not to disturb his 5-year-old son, Xavier, who slept curled up under a worn blanket, clutching a small toy truck that had long since lost its wheels. Arif would watch him for a moment, just a moment, because those seconds were the only luxury he allowed himself before the grind of survival began again. Then he would step into the kitchen corner, boil water, prepare a simple breakfast, and gather himself for another day of work that paid just enough to keep him afloat, but never enough to feel secure. Life hadn't always been this way. There was a time when laughter filled their home, when his wife's voice softened every hardship, when dreams felt reachable. But that life had slipped away in a single night of rain, and headlights and shattered glass. Since then, Arif had lived with a quiet ache that never fully healed, a constant reminder that happiness could vanish without warning. Still, he kept going, because Xavier needed him, and because stopping was never an option. The day he met the girl in the wheelchair started like any other, with dust clinging to his clothes and the distant noise of construction echoing in his ears. The site he had been assigned to that week was unlike the others. It wasn't just another building project. It was a massive estate on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place that seemed to belong in magazines rather than reality. Tall gates, manicured gardens, and a house so large it felt almost unreal. Arif had seen wealth before, but this was something else entirely. It was a kind of wealth that created its own world, separate from everything and everyone else. He kept his head down, focusing on his work, carrying materials, following instructions, trying not to draw attention. Men like him weren't meant to be noticed in places like this. They were part of the background, invisible hands that built the lives of others while their own struggles remained unseen. But that morning, something pulled his attention away from the routine. It was a sound, soft and uneven, like the faint rhythm of wheels moving slowly across stone. He turned his head almost without thinking, and that was when he saw her. She was sitting near the garden, her wheelchair positioned carefully so she could face the open space. Her hair was tied loosely, strands catching the light, and her hands rested gently in her lap. There was a stillness about her, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that came from being used to waiting for help, for movement, for something, anything, to change. Her eyes, though, were alive. They scanned the world with quiet intensity, absorbing everything, as if she refused to let her circumstances limit what she could feel. Arif didn't know her story yet. He didn't know that she was Afia Rahil, the only daughter of one of the wealthiest businessmen in the country, a man whose name carried power in every room it entered. He didn't know about the accident that had taken her ability to walk, or the countless treatments that had failed to bring back what was lost. All he saw was a child who looked like she was carrying more weight than anyone her age should. And something about that broke him a little. Over the next few days, Arif found himself noticing her more often, not in a way that would draw attention, just small glances when no one was looking. He noticed how she watched the workers, how her gaze lingered on simple things, someone lifting a heavy load, someone climbing scaffolding, someone walking freely without thinking about it. There was no envy in her expression, just a quiet longing that was almost impossible to look at for too long. One afternoon, during a short break, Arif sat under the shade of a tree, wiping sweat from his forehead. Xavier's face flashed in his mind, the way his son laughed when Arif came home, the way he ran into his arms without hesitation. It was a reminder of what mattered, of why he endured everything. And then, as if guided by something deeper than thought, Arif stood up and walked slowly toward the garden. He didn't plan what to say. In truth, he didn't think at all. He just moved, driven by an instinct he hadn't felt in years. When he reached her, he kept a respectful distance, unsure if he was even allowed to be there. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she looked at him, really looked at him, and in that brief exchange, something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, not of identity, but of shared understanding, of pain that didn't need words. Arv offered a small, awkward smile. It wasn't much, but it was genuine. And to his surprise, she smiled back. It was faint, hesitant, but it was there. From that day on, something changed. Arv began spending a few minutes of his breaks near her, never intruding, never overstepping. He would talk sometimes, not about anything important, just small things. Stories about his son, about the city, about the strange little moments that made life bearable. He didn't expect her to respond, but sometimes she did, her voice soft but steady. And in those moments, the world seemed to shrink, becoming something simpler, something kinder. He learned her name, Afia, and slowly, piece by piece, her story unfolded. The accident, the treatments, the disappointment that followed every failed attempt at recovery. The way hope had been built up and broken down so many times that it had become something fragile, almost dangerous to hold on to. Arv listened, truly listened, not with pity, but with a kind of quiet respect that Afia hadn't experienced in a long time. And then one day, everything shifted. It happened in the late afternoon, when the sun cast long shadows across the garden. Afia had been watching a group of workers carrying heavy beams, her eyes following their movements with an intensity that suggested something deeper than curiosity. Arv noticed it, the way her fingers tightened slightly, the way her breathing changed. He sat beside her, silent for a moment, then spoke gently, not offering solutions, not making promises, just acknowledging what he saw. And somehow, that was enough to break through the walls she had built. What followed wasn't immediate, and it wasn't easy. Arv didn't have money, didn't have connections, didn't have access to the advanced treatments her family had already tried. But he had something else, something that had been shaped by years of hardship and loss. Persistence, creativity, a refusal to accept that nothing could change. He began researching in his own way, talking to people, observing, thinking. Late at night, after Xavier had fallen asleep, Arv would sit in the dim light of his apartment, sketching ideas, trying to understand what others had overlooked. It wasn't scientific, not in a formal sense, but it was driven by something powerful. The belief that giving up wasn't the only option. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, a plan began to form. It wasn't a miracle in the way people imagine miracles to be. There were no sudden transformations, no instant recoveries. What Arv offered was something far more real, far more difficult. A path, a possibility, a way to try again, not with grand expectations, but with steady, patient effort. Convincing Afia's family wasn't easy. Her father, Rahil Mirzan, was a man who had seen every expert, funded every treatment, exhausted every option. To him, Arv was just a laborer, a man with no credentials, no authority. The idea that he could offer anything of value seemed almost absurd. But Afia insisted, and that made all the difference. What followed was a journey that tested everyone involved. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, days when it seemed like nothing was changing. But there were also small victories, almost imperceptible at first. A slight movement, a stronger response, a flicker of progress that grew, slowly but steadily. Arv was there through all of it, guiding, encouraging, refusing to let despair take hold. He didn't promise success. He only promised that he wouldn't give up, and